Think about it for a second. Have you ever met someone who barely speaks a word, yet for some reason they feel completely impossible to ignore? I want you to picture that specific person in your life right now. You know who I mean. They sit quietly in the corner, they're listening way more than they're talking, and they're just observing. And strangely enough, their silence almost feels louder than other people's actual words. Now, most of us just assume they're shy or maybe awkward or even emotionally distant. But psychology? Well, psychology suggests something entirely different. As it turns out, sometimes the people who speak the least are actually the ones who are thinking the most. All right, let's peel back the very first layer of this psychological onion with Section 1, the power of observation. So what's actually going on when they're just sitting there? They are engaging in what experts call high observational awareness. It's basically the psychological tendency to naturally absorb all these subtle details that louder individuals completely miss. They're kind of like a human radar dish. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that their silence, it's not shyness. It's an active, hypervigilant state of studying the room. While everybody else is super busy talking just to express themselves, the quiet person is deliberately staying silent so they can understand others first. And what exactly are they picking up on? Well, literally everything. We're talking about your tone of voice, tiny facial expressions, the length of your pauses, and just the overall energy behind your words. Because their brains naturally absorb all these micro details, they can often sense tension in a room before anyone even says a single word. They spot fake behavior super quickly, and they notice emotional shifts in an instant. But, as you might guess, this constant, relentless observation, it can become totally exhausting. It really drains the mental battery. I mean, when you notice too much, you inevitably start understanding things you might wish you didn't. Moving right along, let's look at the next layer in Section 2, silence as self-protection. To understand this, we have to look at what psychology calls emotional guarding. It's this really interesting subconscious adaptation where a person keeps their thoughts tucked away inside. And why do they do this? Usually, it's because past vulnerability led to them being criticized or ignored or judged. You see, a lot of quiet people weren't actually born silent. Life kind of made them that way. If speaking up in the past just meant they were told their emotions were too much, well, their brains simply adapted. It learned to keep things locked down to stay safe. And that leads us to a really core truth about all of this. It is definitely not because they don't feel deeply. Actually, it's because they feel way too deeply. Over time, staying silent just starts feeling a whole lot safer than being vulnerable. So, how does this emotional guarding actually play out when you're talking to them? That brings us to Section 3, thinking before speaking. Look, there is a massive, fundamental difference between speaking while thinking and thinking before speaking. One style is all about rapid responses, just rushing to fill the awkward silence. The other style, it involves filtering through hundreds of thoughts, running through the consequences, and truly valuing the weight of words. This is exactly why quiet people will usually just dodge meaningless small talk about the weather. To them, words really matter, so they aren't going to waste them casually. When they pause before answering a simple question, it's not because their mind is blank. Actually, scratch that. It's the exact opposite. Their mind is processing a massive, complex cognitive load. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, craving real connection. Because of how deeply they process things, quiet individuals often really struggle in loud, chaotic environments. Surface-level interactions, like fast opinions, constant background noise, people desperately seeking attention. It's just incredibly draining for them. Instead, they crave real depth. We're talking genuine conversations, raw emotions, and finding absolute peace in solitude. Psychology tells us that highly introspective people often have inner worlds that are vastly stronger than their outer ones. Their own mind becomes their safe space, which means they can spend hours entirely alone without feeling lonely. For them, solitude isn't emptiness at all. It's just peace. Getting down to the core now, we reach Section 5, the hidden emotional overload. There's a brilliant quote that hits the nail right on the head here. Silence does not mean absence of emotion. Sometimes it means hidden emotional overload. While a lot of people just release their emotions instantly, quiet people tend to internalize them. They might let those feelings build silently for years. So, the quietest people in any given room are very often fighting the absolute loudest battles inside their own minds. And finally, we arrive at our last section, the language of silence. Okay, we need to debunk a massive societal myth right here, right now. There's this pervasive idea that quiet people are arrogant or unfriendly or maybe even weak. But the reality? They are simply being highly selective with their energy. They just don't feel this burning urge to constantly prove themselves or to dominate the conversation.
They prefer authenticity over popularity every single time. In a world where absolutely everyone is practically shouting to be noticed, a person who remains calm and silent is pretty rare. And unfortunately, that gets misunderstood as arrogance, when in truth, they're just being incredibly selective about who they trust with their words.
This dynamic is summed up so beautifully by this thought. Some people become quiet not because they have nothing to say, but because they finally realized not everyone deserves access to their thoughts. It makes sense, right? Once someone has experienced enough emotional disappointment, they simply stop leaving their front door wide open for just anyone. To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a slightly provocative question to think about. Is silence really just an absence of words, or is it a completely different language of its own? The next time you encounter someone who barely talks, try not to rush to judgment. Just remember that right behind that silence is a mind that's constantly thinking, a heart that's constantly feeling, and a rich, complex story that nobody ever bothered to ask about. Silence is a language, and sometimes it speaks volumes more than words ever could. If this explainer helped you understand the quiet people in your life, or hey, maybe even yourself, a little bit better, be sure to join us next time as we keep decoding the fascinating world of human behavior. Thanks so much for learning with us today.